We went south to Kharkov, through Volga, through the Ural Mountains, in the direction of Sverdlovsk. We didn't know where exactly they were taking us. We looked through the window. Sometimes the train stopped at the stations, but very rarely, so we could get some hot water called kiepatak, or a piece of bread. I was 14 years old then, so I was the one who jumped from the train to get the water and the bread and bring it into the train car. During the transport, newborns were dying because the mothers didn't have breast milk for them. It was a bitter cold. Old people were dying. This train was a trial of physical resistance. In addition, we felt degraded in a sense. There were terrible conditions, not hygienic at all. Sometimes the train stopped in the fields. We were told to get out of the cars. The soldiers stood with the guns on both sides, and people had to take care of the physiological needs. There was no difference, woman or man or child, all together. It was very degrading. It opened our eyes to what kind of world we were entering. As if that weren't enough, on our way, during our travel to the east, the regular Russian people begged us for help, asked us for help. It was just unbelievable, unthinkable. They lived in such terrible conditions. Somewhere around, maybe after 3 weeks, maybe after 2, we passed by Petropavlovsk, and the train stopped in the station, and they threw us out. And there we stayed. It was the end of April, so the cold wasn't so severe. The winter wasn't so terrible. After 2 days, trucks came and they took us to different settlements. My family, we arrived in the region of a little town called Marievka. We couldn't cross the river. The bridges were broken. The water had flooded over the banks, so we spent a few days in a building. I don't remember what they called it, but it was a building in the middle of this small town. We stayed there overnight, waiting to cross the river on the ferry. And we spent May Day there. Of course, a big holiday. Young Bolsheviks, Russians, got drunk. They marched around our building and shouted, singing, "Polish dogs, Poles." It really looked dangerous. This angry crowd of drunken people. The situation looked very dangerous. Eventually they took us, on trucks, 130 miles from there. 130 miles on the plains, and again they left us there, on the plains, near a small settlement, a cooperative farm, really. The residents were mostly Ukrainians, who were deported from the Ukraine in the 1930s. The environment was interesting. I heard stories and read in books that in the south there were only plains without greenery or trees. But where we were on the plains, there were forests, birch forests, and swamps. So the situation was better. But first we had to find somebody, ask someone to take us in as tenants, because they left us there on the plains and said, "Do what you want." So those Ukrainians, I don't know why, but they were called Hakli. I don't know why, but it was a popular name to call them. They understood our situation and accepted us. There were maybe 7 or 8 Polish families which were thrown into this place, and eventually every family found a place to live, a roof over their heads. In the first year, it was summer already, there weren't any opportunities to make a living. They didn't send us to work or to the kolkhoz. They simply left us to chance, to our own luck. Everybody looked for any opportunity just to survive. So the things which my mother was able to take with her, clothing or jewelry, slowly she had to sell those things or exchange them for flour or different things necessary to live there. I was given work clearing out the forest. I was given a camel with which to gather the wood, pieces of wood, heavy pieces, cut from the forest. I never had to deal with a camel before. This animal isn't really a nice animal. There was a lot of wormwood, so camels ate it, chewed it, and when they got angry, they spit the wormwood. And if you were not careful, you could wind up green. They also made very strange sounds. Eventually, I disciplined it, and it listened to me, and somehow we worked together. Another job was digging something like a stove or a well to make tar out of birch bark. The bark was burnt, grilled, and up from the bottom of the well, under the pressure and the temperature, tar would flow. They used it as something they smeared, like grease, but it was a wonderful thing to use to fight the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes there were unbearable. There were so many of them, not on the plains, but in the forest and in the swamps in the winter. Cold frost was there all summer, so the ice wasn't melting. So there were a lot of mosquitoes, and we used the tar to protect ourselves from them. Our first winter in Siberia, I remember well. It was very difficult. We were changing places, moving. They didn't like us anymore in one place. We had to move to another place. But in the next year, in 1941, after the war started when the Germans attacked Soviet Russia, all young Russians were taken to the army. So at that time, they took us to work in the kolkhoz. I am indebted to my mother, who had experience, because she survived the First World War and the Bolsheviks' war in the 1920s. So we had an opportunity to build our own home on the plains. A house. No, not a house. A mud hut. It is impossible to call it a house made out of turf. So we drove to the plains with a plow, and we dug away the turf. We brought it to a spot we had chosen, and later, I asked an older Russian who had experience how to build it. So we built this mud hut. At night, we drove to the forest and stole some wood to make a ceiling and a roof. To build a house was a great achievement. In the beginning, when my mother told me that we could try to build a house, I listened, but I didn't believe, because I had no idea how to do it. We were so lucky we had a roof over our heads. One day at a time, we built it. Interesting. We didn't need any permits. We didn't ask for anybody. We just went to the outskirts of this settlement and said, "This place is good." And we built the house. There wasn't any formality, no money needed at all. Sometimes the situation forced people to be this enterprising. As a young boy, I worked in the kolkhoz, gathering the grain, and I could pocket a little on the side. So when the fall of 1941 came, and we heard the news, we only got the news from the Russian newspaper Pravda, Truth, where the truth was never written. 2 months later, to the date, we learned of the Siekierski-Maysky Treaty and the forming of the Polish army. But we didn't know where, when, what. So later, in November, a group of young boys, I was not of army age then, yet we decided to go and to look for help, any help. We left our mother in Siberia. She was safe. She had a roof over her head and the grain. And my brother, 4 years younger than me. We left them there, He was 10 or 11, and we went to look for the Polish army.